Hello, everyone, and welcome to ICLR's Friday Forum. This is Sophie Gilbo, and I'll be your host today for this webinar. Today, we have the privilege of having Dr. Marty Alexander with us, who's going to share his thoughts on how we should live with fire in Canada's forest. Dr. Alexander is a registered professional forester who began his wildland fire career in 1972 as a hotshot crew member. He retired from full-time work in late 2010 as a senior fire behavior research officer after nearly 35 years with the Canadian Forest Services. His primary research and technology transfer interests have principally focused on the practical application of empirical fire behavior knowledge to community protection and firefighter safety concerns. Just before I pass it over to Marty, just a couple of technical things. First, I'd like to invite everyone to type your questions in the question box during Dr. Alexander's presentation, and I'll be happy to ask them to him at the end of our presentation. Also, I'd like to let everyone know that our next Friday Forum will be on June 12th, and we'll have Kevin Simmons, who will present on how to use the building code to prevent wind damage. So with that, I'll pass it over to Dr. Alexander. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. Thanks for the introduction, and I'd like to thank Paul Kovacs for the invitation to present today. This is a topic that's dear to my heart, and I hope I'm able to impart some thoughts and ideas that you might learn to embrace. Just to give you a little more background on myself, which may set the stage for some of the things I'll discuss today, just a little bit more detail on my background. I actually first got my taste with wildland fire or wildfire back in 1965 as a 13-year-old Boy Scout, and that was followed up with a couple of seasons on a hotshot crew out of Wyoming. And as Sophie mentioned, I spent a vast, nearly 35 years with the Canadian Forest Service in fire research. I'd like to point out that I worked in every province and territory except Nunavut, and I've had the unique opportunity to personally observe many large-scale boreal fires. As shown in the photograph on the right, this was as a fire behavior analyst on an operational overhead team back in 1998 on the Virginia Hills fire near Whitecourt. So during my career, I occasionally ventured out into operations. Just to give you an idea of what the discussion will follow today, here's a roadmap. We'll analyze the interface situation in Canada. We'll talk a little bit about fire behavior and how it's related to suppression. We'll dwell into the concept of fuels management, and finally, more specifically, we'll look at the practicality of using Aspen fuel breaks to solve the interface problem, and finally conclude with what's ahead. Let's look at the interface situation in Canada, either interface or intermix. It's used, terminology varies across the world, in fact, but basically it's where the built environment intersects with humans. So wildfires threat both members of the general public and firefighters. They also can impact other values of risk, including homes or timber resources, etc. The interface fire problem is not a new issue in Canada per se. In fact, between 1825 and 1938, there were 9 major wildland fire disasters across Canada, from Fernie, BC, all the way to New Brunswick. Generally, there was loss of life associated with all of these wildland fire disasters. They pale in comparison, of course, to the COVID situation currently, but they're still significant. The interface fires have continued since the turn of the century. And so there are many interface fires that have occurred, for instance, in the last 20 years, such as the Kelowna fires in 2003, fire in Halifax in 2009, Slave Lake 2011, and of course Fort McMurray in 2016. Some people have asked, can't we simply eliminate the interface problem? And it's a valid question, but there's many facets to trying to answer it. We don't seem to be able to prevent human-caused fires, no matter what we try to do. Theoretically, we should be able to, but we simply can't, or it appears to be the case. And even if we could, we'd still have to contend with lightning-ignited fires. When we look at how fire protection has evolved in the last 100+ years, what was done in the 1920s, for instance, looks a lot like what we currently do. Even though there's been technological advances over time, really it all looks pretty much the same. There have been some major technological advances, such as the development of the CL-215 air tanker in the late 60s by Canada Air, and the helitorch creation back in the mid-70s by the Canadian Forest Service. But I don't believe that there's really any radically new concept in fire suppression that's going to come in the future. It may be, but I personally believe that we've pretty much expended what is possible. Dave Williams was a director of the former Forest Fire Research Institute in Ottawa. And back in 1963, he wrote that early forest fire control practice in Canada was rather simple. One tried to keep wildfires out of the settlements and in the woods where they belong. There was no planning. Fire was fought wherever it could not be avoided. Perhaps we need a new philosophy. And in Dougal Drysdale's book on the introduction to fire dynamics, he points out that further major advances in combating wildfire are unlikely to be achieved simply by continued application of the traditional methods. What is required is a more fundamental approach which can be applied at the design stage. And such an approach requires a detailed understanding of fire behavior. So let's just briefly talk about what fire behavior is and isn't. What is fire behavior? Well, a formal definition is defined as the manner in which fuel ignites, flame develops, fire spreads, and exhibits other related phenomena as determined by the fire environment. So what is the fire environment? The fire environment is defined as the surrounding conditions, influences, and modifying forces of topography, fuel, and fire weather that determine fire behavior. So 3 components of the fire environment is shown by this inverted isosceles triangle. which is collectively referred to as the fire behavior triangle. You'll notice on the fuel leg of the triangle that it shows trees. It also shows houses. So this particular version of the fire behavior triangle was put forth by Clive Countryman in 1972 and has been used or modified since that time. Extreme fire behavior is a term that's used in a variety of audiences, even on the media, but basically it indicates or represents a level of fire activity that precludes any direct fire suppression action. It involves one or more of the following: either high spread rates and intensities, crown fires or crowning, prolific spotting, large fire whirls, and well-developed convection columns. So what is the connection between fire behavior and fire suppression? Well, the best way to illustrate the connections is shown here, where in order to have fire, we need to have three requirements. This is referred to as the fire triangle. So we need to have heat or an ignition source, air or oxygen, and fuel. Those are the three requirements. So in order to stop a fire from burning, we must remove either the heat, the air, or the fuel by the various techniques, either dropping water or retardants to control the heat, knocking out the oxygen that's feeding the fire by, as shown here, is using a flapper, or as shown on the right, by using mechanical machinery to cut a fire guard. Each of those resources has a production rate, and in order to contain a fire following ignition, the production rate of the suppression resource has to exceed how fast the fire increases its perimeter in order to achieve successful containment. So that's a fundamental idea shown here in this picture, with a ground crew having suppressed a fire occurring in black spruce. The real question is it realistic to expect that we can control all fires before they reach conflagration levels? However, on some days, fuels, weather, and topography conditions coupled with an ignition source can lead to extreme fires. This is especially becoming more common in light of increasing climate variability, forest health issues, and the effects of a legacy of attempted fire exclusion in some jurisdictions. So fuels and weather are starting to create problems that appear to be mounting. So just how can we ever hope to accomplish this? Control wildfires before they rage out of control. This has been an issue for 100+ years. This leads us to the concept of fuels management as a possible aid to fire suppression. It's not a new idea, but it needs to be re-explored. So it's based on the premise that started to emerge in the 60s by several U.S. fire researchers that the likelihood of modifying the topography or topographic component of the fire environment is not seen as feasible. nor can we readily modify the air mass or weather component of the fire environment. However, it has been tried in the past using cloud seeding to induce rain. So what about the third component of the fire environment, the fuel component? That appears to be the only thing that we're left with. So if we can't control the ignitions, we still have lightning to contend with. Even if we could control all man-caused or human-caused fires, we can't modify the topographic component of the fire environment. We can't modify the weather. We're just left with the fuels. And this is not a new idea, but I don't think it's been aggressively embraced. So what is the basic premise behind fuels management? Well, we can't readily control the weather or reshape the topography, but we can influence the quantity and character of wildland fuels. That's the basic premise. So what is the purpose of fuel management? Simply stated, the goal is to proactively lessen the potential fire behavior and thereby increase the probability of successful containment and to minimize the adverse impacts. More specifically, it's to decrease the rate of fire spread and in turn fire size and intensity, as well as crowning and spotting potential, those being aspects of extreme fire behavior. There are three principal techniques or means of fuel management: either reduction or manipulation, conversion, or isolation. And we'll take a look at all three of these techniques in a little more detail. Fuel reduction by using fire. Now, this is a viable technique in some forest types, such as found in southern British Columbia in the form of Douglas fir, ponderosa pine. But it's not a compatible technique for thin bark species such as occur in the boreal forest, although some attempts have been made to use fire in jack pine forests. By and large, it's restricted to certain forest types that were found in southern British Columbia. Maybe to a small extent, also the red and white pine forests of eastern Canada. Now, fuel manipulation is a rearrangement and in some cases a reduction of forest fuels, either canopy or the trees themselves or on the ground. This can be accomplished by hand or by mechanical means. Some cases, such as mulching, it's simply a rearrangement of the fuels in the stand. The actual total biomass or quantity of fuel remains the same, it's just been rearranged. Now, fuel conversion. Fuel conversion involves the converting of one vegetative type to another. So we're going from a flammable type to a less flammable type, which is illustrated here, and going from a black spruce forest to an aspen stand or an aspen forest. So going from a flammable state to a less flammable state. The third principal technique is fuel isolation, which is shown here for the Watson Lake community in the Yukon Territory, either by a fire break or a fuel break. Now, this terms, fuel break and fire break, are often used interchangeably, but they are rather very distinct techniques. A fire break is the creation of a barrier to fire, generally involving the creation of mineral soil exposure. So most ideally created in grasslands by plowing, or in forested areas by the creation of roads, which could either be a simple dirt road or covered in gravel. The fuel break involves the creation of a vegetative complex that's less flammable than the surrounding landscape. Now, all three of these overall techniques could be used in combination. So the conversion could be, fuel conversion could be used to create a deciduous fuel break, which we'll talk about in greater detail as we go along here. So this brings us to the point of the main thrust of today's presentation. Are Aspen fuel breaks a viable solution to the wildland-urban interface fire problem? And I pose that question, and I'm hoping to create some interaction with the audience on this topic. When you look at this is a map of the Aspen distribution in North America, the green area, and it's not to imply that this amount of landscape is covered in a thick blanket of aspen. It's simply a reflection that aspen has been detected across this vast area in Canada from shore to shore and into the lake states and the west parts of western U.S. So it's a very widely spread species. I think we all have experienced walks in aspen forests in the fall when the colors have turned from green to yellow and reds. It's a very attractive species, I think we'd all agree. In the summer following spring snow melt, we get what's referred to as green up. So this is the leafing out of the overstory trees and the greening up of the understory vegetation. And what makes aspen an attractive from the standpoint of viewing it to create fuel breaks comprised of aspen is that the moisture content of the understory vegetation in the summer is very high, as well as the moisture content of the overstory tree leaves is also very high. There are a number of other characteristics of the environment that make it also attractive. The reduction in wind in the summer, once things are leafed out, there's less wind penetration. There's a lack of ladder fuels like branches up the tree boles. There's not that much in the terms of a moss layer that you see in tree lichens on black spruce in their lower branches. So rather clean, what the foresters would call clean boles. Aspen forests are still susceptible to low to moderate intensity fires in the spring and to a certain extent in the fall. But the spring fire season is where you see most of the fire activity in aspen forests as compared to the summer and fall. Now this is a little bit of a busy slide, but I wanted to show a comparison of what the fire potential is in a black spruce forest versus an aspen forest in the spring at the 95th percentile burning condition. So this would be up to the 5% worst days on record. So it's not the worst case, but it's an average worst case, if you will. And it's for Alberta. So using the Canadian Forest Fire Behavior Prediction System, we'd find that the rate of spread in a black spruce forest under this 95 percentile conditions would be about 14 meters a minute. In contrast, in an aspen forest, it's only 3 meters a minute. So about 5 times worse in the black spruce compared to the aspen. Now, a leafed out or a green up aspen stand would be about half a meter a minute. More importantly, is a type of fire that would occur under these conditions. In a black spruce forest, it would be a continuous crown fire, so we would have flames above the canopy. In an aspen forest, we're looking at moderate intensity surface fire, so maybe flames a meter long or a meter high. So these differences can be taken advantage of in terms of if we could create aspen fuel breaks, suppression resources would have that opportunity to contend with fires with much less intensity and rate of advance or perimeter increase. I want to point out that as aspen forests age, start to deteriorate, there's very often an increase in the amount of material that is on the ground, and the spruce understory that's generally present in most aspen or mixed wood forests in turn increase their growth. So these are not viable situations for creating aspen fuel breaks. The forest needs to be turned over and regenerated periodically. Now, the notion of the variation in flammability with season in aspen forests has been known for a very long time. Canadian fire research pioneers Jim Wright and Herb Beale wrote about it in an article in Pulp and Paper magazine of Canada back in 1934. So we've known the general knowledge for a long time. Firefighters, fire operations personnel have known about the differences in flammability between black spruce and conifer forests in general and aspen. They've used the knowledge from what they've seen over the years to engage large landscape scale fires. This is an interesting photo from the Northwest Territories taken by former fire science manager Rick Landeville back in 1979, showing a wildfire from the top image, part of the image, to the bottom part being mitigated by an aspen forest created by a First Nations family over about a 70-year period. It's a rather dramatic photo, I think. The effectiveness of aspen as a fuel break was demonstrated during a experiment in the Northwest Territories back in 1999. You can see in the upper left-hand portion of this collage of photographs ignition along a plot edge, experimental plot edge, that comprised of jack pine and black spruce. And in the lower right-hand photo, the aftermath. So it initially crowned from the ignition line, reached the aspen forest, dropped to the ground, and basically, for practical purposes, stopped. Now, the notion of aspen fuel breaks is nothing new. In fact, I've been able to determine that the concept of deliberately creating an aspen fuel break began back in the mid-60s in Wisconsin, in the Lake State, U.S. Lake States. So the idea has been around for a long time. Why it hasn't been more forcibly used in protecting communities, I don't know. I've pondered this question for a long time. Not sure why we haven't embraced the idea. There are several examples of where communities have been converted to aspen forests by horrific wildfires. One such case occurred in the community of Faro in the Yukon Territory back in 1969. A lightning-caused fire occurred about 8 kilometers from the community, and within 3.5 hours went through the community of Faro and basically severely impacted the community. So immediately after the fire you see all the skeleton spruce that were left. Present day shows this flushing of aspen that's been created by the fire, which is a normal successional pathway from mature mixedwood forest to, in the aftermath of the fire, a tremendous amount of growth. So this is unplanned fuel conversion to an aspen forest. The most recent example of this occurred on the Fort McMurray fire in 2016. Good parts of the fire that were burnt at Fort McMurray involved boreal mixedwood or an aspen spruce forest, as shown here, where you see the spruce in the understory is starting to reach the same heights as the aspen. What normally happens in a mixedwood forest is the aspen proliferates, grows rather quickly in the first 10 or 15 years, and the spruce is much slower growing, so it's not readily seen until many years later, as shown in this photo. Now here's an image taken last September in Fort McMurray near one of the subdivisions, showing the aspen regeneration or aspen suckers, around 2 meters tall, very dense. You see the skeleton spruce aspen forest with all the snags or dead trees intermixed with the young aspen forest. Although I didn't venture into the aspen forest, I wonder just how many spruce seedlings are regenerating under the aspen. So if they're not tended to in a timely manner, they'll grow to be converted right back to what it was like back in 2016. So let's look ahead and ponder where things might go and what do we do next. I certainly embrace the idea that it's been promoted by the Canadian Wildland Fire Strategy that dealing with the interface problem or the wildfire problem in general is a shared responsibility So I believe there's a number of organizations that could make a difference when it comes to embracing the notion of Aspen fuel breaks in a good deal of Canada. I think we need the review of the idea and the support of the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers that if this is a viable strategy, Aspen fuel breaks for a good deal of the communities in Canada, then we need their support. I think we also need to engage the Canadian Forest Service, either its fire research group or as well as the Wood Fiber Center, in looking at Aspen fuel breaks. There's several questions that still need to be answered. What's an optimum fire break width of Aspen? That needs to be addressed. There's a whole host of literature over the last 125 years on Aspen ecology and management that needs to be boiled down for a community, either an individual homeowner or a vegetation specialist in local government. The Fire Smart Canada have in their manual makes mention of Aspen, but not specifically Aspen fuel breaks. But I view them as the possible champion for the cause, either through workshops or their publication materials. Industry certainly have a role to play. Would they give a break on homeowner premiums if they found that a community had created an Aspen fuel break? There's a good number of other interest groups, I think. Tree Canada, the Canadian Institute of Forestry, and the Federation of Canadian Municipalities are just some of the possible groups that I think could have a hand in embracing and promoting the idea of Aspen fuel breaks as a solution to the interface problem. Why we haven't been able to get this across to the public is something as I mentioned earlier, I've pondered. So perhaps we should start with an opinion survey among the public. As if they heard of the idea, and if they learned more about it, would they embrace the idea? I'd like to just thank a few people that have, over the years, the last 40 years or so, have we've had many discussions over a few brews to discuss, how to deal with the interface problem. So I'd like to thank this group of people as shown here. Thank you. So with that, I'll say thank you for your attention today, and I'd like to hear what you might have to say or questions proposed. Is there some flawed thinking here or greater explanation needed? I'm all ears. You'll find on the version of this presentation that'll be archived a series of background items that you might want to explore in greater detail. So with that, I'll open it up for questions. Sophie?
Marty, thank you so much. This was a great and very thoughtful presentation. I can tell you from the high participation we had today that I'm not the only one that took a strong interest in it. So thank you for that. We already have a few questions on the line. If anyone else has additional questions, please type them in the question box, and I'll be happy to ask them to our speaker. So I'll get going, and I apologize in advance if there's some words that I don't pronounce properly. I'm not super familiar with the technical terms used in wildfire management. So the first question: should the aerial glyphosate spraying of cut blocks be eliminated as it is done to remove the deciduous component of the plantations, leading them to be that much more a fire hazard?
Well, being a good politician, I won't try to address that directly, but certainly the spraying of herbicides in harvested areas is a standard vegetation technique used in forest industry to decrease the aspen growth and increase the conifer that's either been seeded or planted. And I know that's a very widely used technique. I don't know if we can entirely eliminate it. So my idea here is we're looking at what's adjacent to a community within, say, 1 or 2 kilometers. So what happens beyond that? Yeah, it's certainly anything that hastens the conifer growth, the spruce, pine growth, is ultimately more flammable than what it's like immediately after harvesting or after a fire. So is that enough?
Yeah,
I think
that's very helpful. Thanks.
Yeah.
We have another question. Earlier in your presentation, you referred to something as the 95th percentile conditions. Would you be able to explain a little bit more what is meant by that?
Well, it's the 95th percentile burning conditions means that if we had 30 years of record and the worst 5% of the worst days, that would be the threshold condition. So it's not the absolute worst possible burning conditions or fuel dryness and wind, but it's the 5% of the days are worse than that condition. I don't know if that's...
Yeah, okay. Thank you. That
Yeah.
clarifies.
So it's not the 99th percentile would be maybe something like Fort McMurray.
Okay, that's a good example.
Yeah.
Another question more specific to the aspen tree. With repeated burning, do aspen rootstocks produce less vigorous sprouts?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
When you have repeated burnings, do the aspen trees produce less vigorous sprouts over time?
If you're able to repeat burning, I mean, the one fire may eliminate so much fuel that it's not possible to have short intervals between fires. But it's one of those cases possible, but you know, it's not always the case.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, next question. Do you have any experience or knowledge on converting pure spruce, and the person mentioned C2 or C3 to aspen? And do you have any thoughts to share on best practices to maintain aspen trees once they're established?
Well, it's a long question. This is where I mentioned that perhaps the Wood Fibers Center of the Canadian Forest Service might be able to compile a manual on aspen ecology and silviculture or the management of aspen forest. But there's certainly we've in the forestry circles have produced a ton of research on aspen ecology, and surely we can bring that all to bear. So my experience has been more what happens after a wildfire and what occurs in terms of regeneration. So certainly you end up with a rather dense aspen forest after wildfire, shown in that Fort McMurray image. So that needs to be tended. The forest needs to be tended. So this isn't a just burn the forest and the aspen's going to come back exactly like you want it. There's going to have to be some tending, but I think it's the possible solutions that we have are rather limited in the boreal. So this is one of the most viable options I think we have.
Okay, Thank you very much. So another question, a similar topic. Do you know what would be the average cost per hectare of converting to aspen from another species, for example, black spruce? And do you also, so it's a two-part question, do you also know how this cost would compare to manipulation treatment cost per hectare by mechanical means?
No, I don't have any costs at my fingertips. I would have to look it
No
up.
problem.
Yeah. So burning is just simply burning is relatively cheap. So some of the treatments to regenerate an aspen forest may involve, or converting may involve logging with fire. So that's going to increase the cost, but the harvested wood or the fiber may offset some of the treatment costs. And that's another thing that needs to be explored, and that's why I put up that list of various interest groups that need to be brought into the fold here in terms of developing an overall strategy.
Okay, sounds great. We're going back to a bit more of a general question. So you mentioned several large fires happening in Canada in the early 1900s. Do you feel we've learned anything from these experiences?
Well, as a species, we have very short memories. And one of the papers that I indicated was available to at the end of this talk was something I wrote back in 2010 called Lest We Forget, and it was based on an experience I had, or the impetus for the paper was I went to New Brunswick in 2009 to give a presentation at the New Brunswick Fire Chiefs Luncheon. And I was greeted by the local fire chief, and come to find out he'd never heard of the 1825 Miramichi fire, which turns out is the largest wildfire in eastern North America. And yet he was born and raised not too far from where the fire occurred. So it struck me as I guess I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was surprised that he'd never heard of something that occurred literally in his backyard. And even though he was in the structural side of the fire business, he'd never heard of it until I'd mentioned it to him. So, no, I don't think we've learned, and that's why I ended up reviewing what we had done to honor the people that, for instance, that had died in these disaster fires. I hope that's...
Yeah, no, that helps. Thank you. You also covered earlier in your presentation different types of fuel management, including fuel breaks. Would you be able to compare the benefits of an aspen fire break versus simply bare land, for example? And how would these two things perform in comparison?
Well, bare land would be, you might find in like the southern prairies where you've just got open grassland. The problem with fire breaks and plowing and creating an open mineral soil is, one, you've got wind erosion problems and possibility of invasive species. So it's not the best possible solution. Whereas, at least with an aspen forest, you've mitigate against those kind of problems.
Okay. Sounds great. We have a question that's a little bit more regional. Are you aware of what fire research is happening in the Yukon these days? Because we have one of our participants that's interested in getting involved in some wildland fire modeling in that area. So I don't know if you are aware, if you know people that she could connect with.
Yes. Is it appropriate to do that offline, or?
Of course, I'll share information after.
Yeah, you can. If I can get a email address, I can put that person in. Yes, I am aware of somebody.
Sounds great. All right. Sorry, do you know if the use of Aspen as fire protection is an approach that's been traditionally used by First Nations people in the past?
It certainly has been used, as shown on that one image from the Willow River in the Northwest Territories in 1979. But I'm not aware of any more specifics than that. I do know that First Nations families used to traditionally burn out around their living area, and then would reduce the fuels in that way. But whether that was specifically targeted to increase the aspen growth, I'm not aware. But there is a publication by Professor Harold Lutz at Yale University back in the late 50s that summarized the First Nations fire activities, and so that's where I've got that knowledge from. But whether they were specifically targeting aspen, I'm not aware.
Okay, thank you very much. We have someone interested in the difference between mature aspen forests and the ones that are not fully mature, especially as because once they are mature, they're not as effective as fire breaks. So could you recommend what are some of the strategies for dealing with the forests, the aspen forests that are now mature, once they become a little bit more ineffective as fire breaks?
Well, I think this kind of comes back to the notion of what in foresters call stand tending. So those, it's not just the creation of the aspen fuel break and you leave it alone. It's going to have to be managed over time, perhaps a 60 to 80 year cycle where thinning out I'm not proposing that we eliminate the conifer component completely, but we're keeping it under control. So in the case of Fort McMurray, now's the grand opportunity to go in there and pluck out some of the spruce seedlings when it could be done basically by just pulling up the seedling. As time goes on, it's going to get much more difficult to do that. I mean, eventually you have to get machetes, and once those are ineffective, you're going to have to use chainsaw. So I think what communities should start to look at is having a forester on staff or a vegetation specialist that is responsible for management of the aspen forest. But even the old growth forest, older mature aspen forests can still be managed to be healthy and productive in nature.
Okay, thank you. So we've talked a lot about the performance of the aspen forest. Do you know if they are as attractive commercially to forestry companies as other species like pine and spruce?
Yeah, some forest companies are strictly managing for aspen, and others for conifer components. So there are. It varies across the country. So.
Okay. Thank you. Going on to another problematic issue with wildfire, do you have any thoughts to share on what can be done on the damaged pine beetle trees, considering this is a huge wildfire risk?
Well, yeah, in the aftermath of the mountain pine beetle, I'm assuming the person's thinking of British Columbia. There was a lot of harvesting or salvaging of lodgepole pine. So even the harvesting salvage material leaves quite a bit of debris afterwards, and that simply can't be left. It needs to be, we used to do back years ago a fair bit of broadcast burning in harvested debris. So the same thing applies, like burning this residue or slash that's left. Because if we're going to seed or plant back on top of a harvested area, we're giving wildfire an advantage to readily take out whatever we invest in our regeneration. So, fire may be the best option, burning the debris in these mountain pine beetle killed areas.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned very early in your presentation that you've had the experience working in most provinces and territories across Canada. Through your career and recent observations, which jurisdictions do you believe are doing among the best job in terms of wildfire management? That's a tricky one.
Who asked that question, might I ask? Who's doing the best job? Well, given the track record across the country over the last 20 to 30 years, I would say nobody is. Everybody might get a C grade out of not a B, A or B, but a C grade. In some cases, maybe a D minus. I've been asked similar questions in the last couple of months by both national and international interests, and I don't believe anybody has really solved the wildfire problem, if you will. The closest I've seen is Western Australia, where they had a major fire event back in 1961 and vowed that it would never happen again. They rolled up their sleeves, got down and did some research on fire behavior and fuel accumulations, and worked out a strategy for rotational burning in their forests, and did a remarkable job. But they were so effective that in the time that I was there back in 1989 to 92, found that the public had come to the point that they wondered why they were still burning, because they didn't have a wildfire problem. And the reason they didn't was because of all the rotational burning every 6 to 10 years. And so you can become so successful that the public doesn't believe there is a fire problem. And they've come as close to coming up with a strategy that fits their environment that I've seen. I don't believe, we're spending an ungodly amount of money on suppression in Canada. We need to reinvest how that money is spent, I believe. That may not be popular in some circles, but somebody needs to stand up and call a spade a spade.
Thanks for sharing your thoughts on this. Building on that question, what would you say are the top 3 wildfire research gaps that would allow us to move forward beyond 2020 from what we have learned and experienced in the wildland-urban interface over the last decade?
The top 3?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't know if I can give 3, but the number 1, not sure it's a research question to be addressed, but it definitely needs to be addressed, is the education of the public on the realities of fire in our forests and what's possible from a suppression standpoint. We still need suppression. We're going to make suppression resources much more effective if we can modify the forest by the creation of, say, Aspen fuel breaks. We can't afford tons and tons and tons of air tankers and pumps and hoses and trucks. Like we just simply can't afford it. So we need to create the fuels that make those resources that we do have that much more effective. But I definitely think we've talked about educating the public for years, but we've never really done a good job. What you see in the school systems nowadays is just a standard Smokey Bear, which we still need, but we've got to broaden the horizon. So I see that as really the number one issue, and the state of Florida and the state of Alaska in the U.S. have developed good programs. Montana has created what's referred to as a fireworks educational system to give teachers materials to talk about. That's another great job. So whether that's research, I don't know, but maybe we need to understand how the people think. There's a great book out by Karen Cerullo called "I Never Saw It Coming." As a species, we don't fear the worst, and so probably the human aspect of research needs to be explored. The human dimension aspect needs to be ramped up. So I would say that's number two. 2 out of 3 is the best I can come up with.
That's great.
But those would be the top 2,
no,
and they're not.
That's helpful,
Yeah.
and it's good to know there's resources available even in the U.S. to help us target some of these gaps. So thanks for sharing that. You mentioned towards the end of your presentation that we have some uncertainty around fire breaks. With that being said, do you have thoughts based on your experience on what a suitable fuel break width should be to effectively modify fire behavior? And the person added, I understand that this is likely dependent upon a number of factors, including the stand structure and fuel loading remaining within the fuel break itself. Do you have any thoughts to offer on this topic? Well,
more is better, or bigger is better. But that's an issue I think that the Canadian Forest Service needs to address, either by looking at past wildfires or by modeling using physical-based models. I mean, a combination of things, maybe a survey of operational personnel. I mean, personally, I would feel comfortable with 2 kilometers, but that's just me. Like, it may be narrower than that. I doubt if it's bigger than 2 kilometers, and that's based on the kind of spotting that you typically get from conifer forests. 2 kilometers is not a worst case, but it's kind of like a near worst case. So, okay. But those are just, if I'm got my back against the wall, that's what I'd say, and with somebody applied some truth serum to me. That's okay. No, it's good. It's good to have a rough idea of a number for sure. Another question. We have lots of questions for you, Marty. So it looks like that's fine. The presentation was very interesting to many. So someone mentioned having been made aware that there's been a decline in aspen forests in various parts of Canada. Are you aware of strategies that are planned or in place to increase this proportion in the future? No, to be honest, no, I'm not. But I am aware of the general problem with restoration of aspen forests in some parts of the country. And part of that restoration problem has been related to overuse by wildlife. Okay. So, but this is where I put in that looking ahead. We need to engage other interest groups that have knowledge that so we're all on the same page.
Okay. No, sounds great.
But it's good question or good comment.
Okay, great. Do you know if aggressive thinning of spruce forest, the person specifies C2, without burning the surface would lead to a stand conversion to aspen?
So the question again was,
will I can read it word for word. Will aggressive thinning of spruce forest, more specifically C2, without burning the surface lead to a stand conversion to aspen?
So opening up a stand by, typically the reason aspen proliferates is that after wildfires that you've created a situation where you warm the surface and that stimulates the suckering. So that's a possibility. I do know in Alaska they've tried a number of fuel treatments in black spruce, and what they found was when they thinned or opened up the stand, there was a proliferation of grass. So the green grass was the outcome that they got, and it surprised them. So I think all the literature, all the research that's been done on aspen ecology and management needs to be brought to bear. And there have been various manuals produced over time, but all this material needs to be reviewed. And I just know by either harvesting or harvesting with fire, you can, if there's some component of the aspen in the stand, it'll increase in its volume.
Okay, thank you very much. Another question, one of our participants mentioned there is a large FBP fuels dataset from the Canadian Wildland Fire Information System, which has many different fuel classifications at a reasonable resolution. Is a dataset like this useful for determining if an aspen stand is effective in reducing fire risk?
Yes, I think, and I'm well aware of that dataset. That's what I mentioned, that the Canadian Forest Service Fire Research Group might look into the modeling or historical fire occurrences in terms of trying to come up with an optimum width. So the overlapping fires that occur in at the landscape level need to be, and I think there's been some work done in this area by Marc Parisienne over the years of overlapping fires. Definitely that gives insight. The problem will be is that older fires trying to clarify or identify the amount of aspen or its character may be difficult, but it's certainly worth one of the things examining. So good question or good comment.
Okay, thank you very much. We talked about fire breaks with more specifically earlier, but someone has a more specific questions about whether or not 100-meter conversion of mixed wood forest to deciduous by selective harvesting be a large enough buffer for a community?
I would say no, not 100 meters. Depends on what's leading up to the aspen, that kind of an aspen width in the community. If it was grass that leads up to the aspen fuel break, yeah, 100 meters would be fine. But if it's conifer, no, I don't. And the reason being is that 100-meter spotting distance is very common in conifer forests like black spruce or jack pine.
Okay, thank you very much. Our last question today is more of a comment from Alan Westhaver, which I'm sure you two probably know each other.
Who was that?
Alan Westhaver. Oh,
yes, I know Alan. Yep.
Yeah. So Alan mentioned that he's also a strong believer in the positive effects of aspen and has used it to benefit on many occasions. He wanted to raise the point on the precaution, my language, just to note that even Aspen is not a silver bullet. Almost all major woolly losses occur under the worst days, and we know those happen in Aspen too. He mentioned it's important for residents and municipal managers to recognize Aspen breaks must be used in conjunction with work by residents to limit the ignition potential of structures. So I'm assuming he means applying some fire smart measures in addition to the benefits that Aspen Forest can provide.
Yeah, I'm glad Alan brought that point up. I intended to make it that it's the homeowner still needs to think about the materials that he's built his house with and what his yard looks like. So it's just like the Aspen fuel breaks enhance the ability of suppression resources. These things have to all be tied together, but I still am convinced that in the boreal forests of Canada, our greatest opportunity to minimize the adverse impacts of wildfires is to look at a strategic placement of Aspen fuel breaks over time and think about that. But perhaps we need a national conference on the subject.
Thank you. Actually, we got one very last question. I guess just as I was reading the last comment from Alan, and I think we'll bring it to a close after that. But are you aware of any communities that have consciously incorporated land development as a way to reduce hazard to communities? For example, agriculture areas, recreation areas, or others?
Well, there's lots of communities that have developed community protection plans, and you can find many of those by just Googling community fire protection plans. But in reviewing them, I don't think they go far enough in terms of embracing the notion of using Aspen fuel breaks as a possible solution. So, did I answer that question?
Yeah, that was perfect. Thank you very much.
Okay.
I'd just like to mention again, beyond the questions, I've received so many comments in the question box about people being appreciative of your historical perspective and experience in bringing this topic to light today. So on behalf of our audience and ICLR, I'd just like to thank you once again for this excellent presentation. Do you have any closing remarks that you'd like to add before we close?
Well, just is the PowerPoint still up?
Yeah.
Yeah, just to point out that I've provided links to all but one of the items here. So the item at the very bottom of book chapter, you'll have my email address on the previous slide. So if you're interested in that particular item, you just send me an email. But all the others, I've provided the link to being able to get a hold of those. So if anybody would like to contact me on further questions, by all means. I hope I have, generated a something here today, and that was kind of my intent. So again, I want to appreciate or thank Paul Kovacs for allowing me to participate in this forum. He contacted me a little more than 6 or 8 months ago and asked if I'd be interested in talking, and I said, well, what would you like me to talk about? He said, anything you want. So this is something that's kind of dear to my heart and has been reinforced with me many times over the years that my good friend Rick Lanaville from the Northwest Territories, I know we spend many an hour talking about Aspen and would go around various communities in the Northwest Territories and find that abandoned roads had suckered back to Aspen. So it seems to grow, virtually everywhere if you disturb the the stand, you can get Aspen to sucker back up. So it's quite a fascinating species. But the point that Al Westaver made about the homeowners still need to look after what they do at the local level or at their house level is still very important. That's a valid point. So
thank you so much, Martin, for your time again. And just to mention before we close, the slides as well as the recording of this webinar will be available on our ICLR's YouTube channel. So you're invited to look for that in the coming days. Thank you very much to everyone who took the time out of their day to participate today. Your questions and just interest in this topic were much appreciated. We look forward to seeing you again on June 12th, I believe, when we have a webinar with Kevin Simmons on how to use the building code to prevent wind damage. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone once again and wish you a great rest of the day. So thank you very much.
Yeah, Sophie, if I might say, everybody stay safe.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Take care of yourselves. Thank you.